The drive from Zaragoza to La Rioja took Peter through some of Spain's most beautiful countryside. Rolling hills covered with perfectly ordered rows of grapevines that stretched to the horizon. The autumn light cast everything in golden tones, creating a landscape that looked like a Renaissance painting come to life. But Peter's appreciation for the scenery was tempered by his growing awareness that each mile brought him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. The documents from the monastery had been specific about the location he was seeking. Bodega de los Secretos, established 1489, 3 kilometers north of Haro on the road to Briones. The vineyard had supposedly been purchased with proceeds from the Zaragoza operation, designed as both a working winery and a secure storage facility for the network's most valuable assets. As Peter approached the town of Haro, he could see why his ancestors had chosen this region for their operations. La Rioja was geographically isolated, surrounded by mountains and accessible only through a few main roads that could be easily monitored. The wine industry provided perfect cover for international commerce, with barrels and shipments moving regularly across European borders without arousing suspicion. The GPS on his rental car led him along increasingly narrow roads that wound through terraced vineyards and past traditional wineries with names like Marqués de Riscal and López de Heredia. But the Bodega de los Secretos wasn't among the famous establishments that welcomed tourists. It was hidden at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by abandoned vines that hadn't been tended in decades. Peter parked his car behind a stone wall where it wouldn't be visible from the main road, then approached the winery on foot. The buildings were substantial stone construction that looked like it could survive centuries, with traditional tile roofs and arched doorways that spoke of significant investment during the vineyard's operational period. But what struck Peter most forcefully was the complete abandonment of the place. Weeds grew between cobblestones in the courtyard, wooden shutters hung broken from their hinges, and grapevines had grown wild, creating an almost jungle-like tangle around the main buildings. A rusted sign by the entrance read Bodega de los Secretos, Fundada 1489, confirming that he had found the right location. But there was no indication of when or why the vineyard had been abandoned, or whether it was still owned by descendants of the families who had established it. Peter found an unlocked door that led into what had once been the winery's main production area. Rows of massive wooden barrels lined the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs but still structurally sound. The air smelled of old wine and damp stone, creating an atmosphere that was both melancholy and mysterious. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through broken shutters, Peter began to notice details that suggested the vineyard hadn't been abandoned as long ago as its condition suggested. Some of the barrels showed signs of recent maintenance, and there were electric lights that appeared to have been installed within the last few decades. More significantly, many of the barrels were marked with symbols that matched those he had seen throughout his Spanish journey. The same Portuguese maritime symbols that had appeared in Toledo, Granada, Barcelona, and Zaragoza. Peter examined the barrels more carefully, looking for any that might contain something other than wine. Most were clearly empty and had been for years, but several in the back row seemed to have been sealed more recently and showed no signs of the wine stains that marked the others. Using a crowbar he found among the abandoned winery equipment, Peter carefully opened one of the sealed barrels. Inside, protected by oiled cloth and waterproof containers, were documents that made him realize the Bodega de los Secretos had been actively used by his family's network much more recently than the 15th century. The first package he examined contained correspondence dated from the 1930s and 1940s, written in Spanish and Portuguese. The letters appeared to be personal rather than business communications, filled with expressions of love and concern, but also with references to dangerous times and the need for temporary separation for safety. One letter, dated March 1937, was particularly revealing. "My dearest Carmen, the arrangements have been made through our Portuguese friends. You and the children will be safe at the vineyard until the troubles pass. The network your grandfather helped establish has promised to protect families like ours, regardless of which side they supported before the conflict began." As Peter continued examining the contents of the sealed barrels, he discovered what appeared to be a complete archive of correspondence from Spanish families who had been helped by the network during the turbulent middle decades of the 20th century. The letters painted a picture of an organization that had evolved from its medieval origins into something like an underground railroad for protecting civilians during periods of political upheaval. The most extensive collection belonged to a couple named Eduardo and Carmen Vasquez. Their correspondence, spanning from 1936 to 1945, told the story of a family separated by circumstances beyond their control, reunited through the help of the Portuguese network, and ultimately settled safely in South America with new identities and financial security. The Portuguese gentleman explains that his family has been helping people like us for over 400 years. Eduardo had written to his wife in 1938. They ask for nothing except that we remember their kindness and help others when we are able. It is hard to believe such generosity exists in these dark times. Carmen's replies, preserved in remarkable condition, revealed the human cost of the historical events that Peter had only read about in textbooks. "The children ask when you will come home," she wrote. "I tell them that good people are helping us stay safe, and that someday we will all be together again in a place where no one will try to hurt us because of what we believe." But it was a letter dated December 1943 that made Peter understand the true scope of his family's activities during this period. Eduardo wrote, "I have learned more about our benefactors from Don Mateus. The network is not just Portuguese. It includes families from Germany, Italy, Catalonia, and even some from England. They have been moving people and protecting assets for centuries, using wine shipments, art collections, and manuscript preservation as cover for their activities." Peter realized that his family hadn't just been preserving documents and artifacts. They had been running a sophisticated international humanitarian operation, using the cover of cultural preservation to protect people whose lives were in danger from political upheaval. The final letter in Eduardo and Carmen's collection was postmarked from Buenos Aires in 1946. "We are safe, we are together, and we will never forget the kindness that saved our family. The vineyard in La Rioja will always be sacred to us, and someday, when it is safe, we will return to thank the Portuguese family that gave us back our lives." What do you think about this humanitarian side of Peter's family legacy? It seems his ancestors weren't just treasure hunters. They were saving lives. But what price comes with inheriting such a powerful network? Share your thoughts in the comments. Peter spent several hours reading through the letters, gradually understanding that the Bodega de los Secretos had served as much more than a storage facility. It had been a safe house, a communication center, and a distribution point for resources that helped displaced families start new lives in safer locations. The documents revealed a network that had operated across multiple countries and decades, coordinating with sympathetic officials, religious organizations, and merchant families to move people and assets out of dangerous situations. The wine barrels hadn't just hidden documents. They had concealed gold, jewelry, artwork, and other portable wealth that could be converted to cash for refugee families. But Peter also found evidence that the network's activities hadn't ended in the 1940s. More recent documents, dating from the 1980s and 1990s, showed that the organization had continued helping people displaced by various conflicts throughout the late 20th century. The tradition continues. Read a note dated 1987, written in English. New generations of the founding families maintain the commitment to protection and preservation. The vineyard stands ready to serve those in need, as it has for 5 centuries. Peter began to understand that his inheritance wasn't just financial, it was moral. He wasn't being asked to simply claim money and assets accumulated by his ancestors. He was being offered leadership of an organization that had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives over the course of its existence. The realization was both inspiring and terrifying. Could he live up to the humanitarian legacy his family had created? And more importantly, was he prepared to accept the risks and responsibilities that came with operating outside normal legal and governmental channels? The weight of legacy. As Peter continued exploring the vineyard, he found evidence that the facility had been designed with security and concealment as primary concerns. The wine cellars connected to a network of underground passages that led to multiple exits, some of them several hundred meters from the main buildings. Storage chambers hidden beneath false floors contained documents, artwork, and other valuables that represented centuries of careful preservation. But the most significant discovery was a modern office hidden behind a false wall in what had appeared to be an abandoned storage room. The office contained computers, filing cabinets, and communication equipment that looked like it had been used within the last few years. The computer files, protected by passwords that took Peter several attempts to crack using significant dates from his family history, revealed the current scope of the network's operations. Bank accounts in multiple countries held assets worth hundreds of millions of euros. Real estate holdings included properties in Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, and several South American countries. Investment portfolios included shares in major corporations, government bonds, and commodity holdings that had been accumulating returns for decades. But more troubling were files that showed the network's continued involvement in moving people and assets across international borders. While the language was careful and often coded, it was clear that the organization was still actively helping individuals and families who needed to relocate quickly and quietly, often without the knowledge or approval of government authorities. Peter found himself facing an ethical dilemma he hadn't anticipated. His family's network had undoubtedly saved lives and preserved cultural treasures, but it had also operated outside legal frameworks for centuries. The humanitarian goals were admirable, but the methods involved document forgery, tax avoidance, and activities that most governments would consider illegal. As he studied the financial records, Peter's phone buzzed with a text message that made his blood run cold. "We know you're at the vineyard, Peter. It's time for a conversation about your future. We're 5 minutes away." Peter quickly gathered the most important documents he had found, stuffed them into his backpack, and looked for an escape route. The underground passages he had discovered earlier might provide a way to avoid whoever was approaching, but he realized that his time for independent exploration had run out. Klaus and his associates had found him, and the choice he had been avoiding since Barcelona was about to be forced upon him. Confrontation underground. Peter made his way to the wine cellars and located the entrance to the underground passage system he had discovered earlier. The passages were narrow and poorly lit, but they offered his best chance of avoiding the confrontation he wasn't ready for. As he moved through the tunnels, Peter could hear voices and footsteps above him in the main winery buildings. Klaus's German accent was unmistakable, but there were at least 2 other people with him, and their conversation suggested they knew the vineyard's layout well. "He'll have found the office by now," Klaus was saying. "The question is whether he's ready to accept the responsibilities that come with the inheritance." "And if he's not?" asked a woman's voice with a British accent. "Then we proceed with containment protocols," Klaus replied coldly. "The network is too important to be compromised by personal sentimentality." Peter found a chamber in the underground system that appeared to have been designed as a secure meeting room. Stone benches lined the walls, and there was evidence of electric lighting and ventilation systems. But more importantly, there were multiple exits that led to different parts of the vineyard property. In this chamber, Peter found the archive he had been seeking since Toledo, the complete records of the network's operations from its founding in the late 15th century to the present day. Leather-bound ledgers contained detailed accounts of assets moved, people protected, and operations conducted across Europe and beyond. The most recent ledger was particularly revealing. It showed that the network currently maintained active operations in 12 countries, with an annual budget of over 50 million euros derived from investment returns on assets accumulated over 5 centuries. The organization helped an average of 200 people per year relocate to safer situations, often providing new identities, financial support, and long-term protection. But Peter also found records of activities that made him uncomfortable. The network had occasionally worked with governments and organizations whose human rights records were questionable, justifying these relationships as necessary for protecting their humanitarian operations. Some of the people they had helped relocate had been fleeing not persecution, but legal consequences for their own actions. The sound of footsteps in the underground passages interrupted Peter's reading. Klaus and his associates had found the entrance to the tunnel system and were systematically searching for him. "Thank you for staying with us through these incredible discoveries." Peter has learned that his inheritance comes with both humanitarian glory and moral complexity. But now he's trapped underground with Klaus closing in. What choice will he make? Peter gathered the most critical documents from the archive and prepared to move deeper into the passage system. But as he reached one of the exits, he found Klaus waiting for him, flanked by the British woman he had heard earlier and a third person he didn't recognize. "Hello, Peter," Klaus said calmly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your family's legacy and your role in continuing it." Peter clutched his backpack containing the documents he had gathered, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I think I've learned enough about my family's legacy, Klaus, including the fact that you've been lying to me since Toledo." Klaus nodded acknowledgement. "I've been managing your introduction to the network, yes, but not lying about its importance or your role in its future. Peter, what you've discovered today represents one of the most significant humanitarian organizations in European history. Your ancestors didn't just preserve documents and accumulate wealth, they saved lives." The British woman stepped forward. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Sarah Chun, representing the Administrative Council of the Preservation Network. We've been monitoring your progress through Spain with great interest." "Monitoring?" Peter challenged. "You mean manipulating? Every city I've visited, every document I've found, every person I've met. It's all been orchestrated to bring me to this moment." "To bring you to understanding," Sarah corrected. "Peter, your family has been the coordinating authority for this network for over 500 years. Your grandfather maintained that authority until his death, at which point operational control passed to a council of allied families. But the network needs a Matthias descendant to function at full capacity." Klaus opened a briefcase and withdrew several documents. "These are the current operational reports, Peter. In the last year alone, we've helped relocate 247 people from dangerous situations. We've preserved artwork and manuscripts worth millions of euros that would otherwise have been destroyed. We've maintained financial networks that allow resources to flow to people and organizations that can't access traditional banking systems." Peter studied the documents Klaus offered, recognizing the scope and sophistication of the operations they described. "And if I refuse to take over this network?" Sarah and Klaus exchanged glances. "Then the network continues under council authority," Sarah replied. "But certain assets and capabilities that are tied specifically to your family's authority would become inactive." "You mean you'd lose access to accounts and resources that belong to my family? Resources that have been used for humanitarian purposes for centuries," Klaus emphasized. "Peter, this isn't about personal wealth or power. It's about continuing a tradition of protecting people who have nowhere else to turn." Peter found himself genuinely torn. The evidence he had seen throughout the day proved that his family's network had indeed saved lives and preserved cultural treasures. But he had also seen evidence of activities that operated in legal and moral gray areas. The confrontation in the underground chamber stretched for nearly an hour, with Klaus and Sarah presenting detailed arguments about Peter's moral obligation to continue his family's humanitarian work. They showed him photographs of families who had been helped by the network, testimonials from people whose lives had been saved, and documentation of cultural artifacts that had been preserved for future generations. But they also made it clear that refusing to cooperate wasn't really an option. The network had invested too much in bringing Peter to this point, and they had accumulated too much knowledge about his activities in Chicago and Spain to simply let him walk away. "You understand information networks, Peter," Sarah pointed out. "You know how valuable certain kinds of knowledge can be, and how dangerous it can be for people who possess it without the proper protection." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If Peter refused to join the network, he would be considered a security risk that needed to be managed. "I need time to think about this," Peter said finally. "What you're asking me to accept is a lifetime commitment to activities that most governments would consider illegal." "Most governments," Klaus replied, "don't understand the difference between criminal activity and humanitarian necessity. Peter, we're offering you the chance to continue a tradition that your family started 5 centuries ago, protecting people and preserving knowledge when official institutions fail to do so." As they argued, Peter noticed that Sarah had positioned herself between him and the exit he had planned to use. But there was another passage, one that he had explored earlier, that led to an emergency exit near the vineyard's northern boundary. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," Peter said, slowly moving toward his alternative exit. "But I need to see more documentation about current operations before I can make such a significant decision." Klaus nodded. That's reasonable. But Peter, understand that we can't allow you to continue traveling around Spain unsupervised. There are other parties interested in what you've been discovering, and not all of them share our humanitarian goals. Peter reached the entrance to his escape passage. Then I guess you'll have to trust that I understand the importance of what you've shown me. Before Klaus and Sarah could react, Peter ducked into the narrow tunnel and began moving quickly toward the northern exit. Behind him, he could hear Klaus calling out, but the passage was too narrow for quick pursuit. Peter emerged from the underground system about 200 meters from where he had parked his rental car. As he made his way through the abandoned vineyard, he could see flashlights moving through the main buildings as Klaus and his associates searched for him. But Peter had accomplished what he had come to La Rioja to do. He now understood the full scope of his family's legacy, both its humanitarian achievements and its moral complexities. More importantly, he had documented evidence of the network's current operations and financial holdings. As he drove away from the Bodega de los Secretos, Peter's phone buzzed with a text message. Running won't solve this, Peter. The choice you're avoiding will find you wherever you go. But perhaps it's time you understood that there are other parties interested in your inheritance, parties that don't share our commitment to humanitarian goals. Peter realized that his Spanish adventure was entering a new phase. He was no longer just discovering his family's history. He was being hunted by multiple parties who wanted to control what he had learned. The documents in his backpack represented centuries of accumulated wealth and power, but they also represented danger for anyone who possessed them without the protection of the network that had created them. As he drove through the dark La Rioja countryside, Peter knew that he needed to make a decision soon. He could accept his role as the inheritor of a humanitarian network that operated outside legal boundaries, or he could try to find a way to escape from a legacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to abandon. But first, he needed to get far enough ahead of Klaus and his associates to have time to think clearly about what he had learned and what choices remained available to him. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible revelation in La Rioja. The abandoned vineyard revealed that Peter's family legacy includes centuries of humanitarian work, saving lives and protecting families during history's darkest moments. But the choice facing Peter has become even more complex. Klaus and his network want him to lead a billion-euro humanitarian organization, but they've also made it clear that refusing isn't really an option. And now there are hints of other parties with less noble intentions who are also interested in Peter's inheritance. The love letters hidden in wine barrels showed the beautiful side of Peter's family legacy, generations of people whose lives were saved by the network his ancestors created. But the modern documents revealed that this humanitarian work comes with moral gray areas and legal risks that could define the rest of Peter's life. What do you think Peter should do? Accept leadership of a network that saves lives but operates outside the law? Or continue trying to escape from a legacy that seems determined to claim him? And who are these other parties that Klaus mentioned? What do they want with Peter's inheritance, and how dangerous might they be? Don't miss the next episode where Peter's journey continues and the stakes get even higher. The choices he makes next could determine not just his own future, but the fate of a humanitarian network that has been operating for over 5 centuries. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. The most crucial decisions are still ahead. The border between Spain and Portugal was marked by little more than a simple sign and an unmanned crossing point. But for Peter, it represented a threshold into a completely different world. As his rental car crossed from Galicia into northern Portugal, he felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that had nothing to do with escaping Klaus and his associates. The landscape changed subtly but noticeably as he drove south toward Porto. The Spanish countryside had been dramatic and stark, full of sweeping vistas and ancient castles perched on hilltops. Portugal felt more intimate, more human in scale, with rolling green hills dotted with small villages and terraced vineyards that looked like they had been tended by the same families for generations. The rain began as Peter approached the outskirts of Porto, a gentle but persistent drizzle that seemed to welcome him to a city that had been built to embrace the Atlantic weather. Unlike the harsh Spanish sun that had dominated his journey from Madrid to La Rioja, the Portuguese rain felt cleansing, almost ceremonial, as if the country itself was washing away the tensions and dangers he had left behind in Spain. Porto's skyline emerged gradually through the mist, dominated by the iconic silhouette of the Dom Luis I Bridge spanning the Douro River and the distinctive red tile roofs that cascaded down the hillsides toward the water. From a distance, the city looked like a watercolor painting that had been left out in the rain, its colors running together in beautiful, imperfect harmony. Peter had booked a small hotel in the Ribera district, the historic heart of Porto that had been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As he navigated the narrow, cobblestone streets that led to his accommodation, he found himself constantly stopping to stare at architectural details that seemed hauntingly familiar, even though he had never been to Portugal before. The azulejos, the distinctive blue and white ceramic tiles that decorated building facades throughout the city, told stories of Portuguese maritime exploration, depicting caravels sailing toward unknown horizons and navigators consulting charts of distant seas. But what struck Peter most forcefully was how many of these tile murals seemed to feature symbols and motifs that matched those he had been seeing throughout his Spanish journey. His hotel, a converted 18th-century merchant's house called the Casa do Bacalhau, sat directly on the riverfront with views across the Douro toward the port wine lodges of Vila Nova de Gaia. The proprietor, a friendly woman named Fernanda, greeted him in excellent English and immediately began sharing recommendations for experiencing authentic Porto. "You have Portuguese features," Fernanda observed as she handed him his room key. "Are you perhaps returning to visit family?" Peter hesitated, unsure how much of his story to share. "My family originated here, yes. The name was Mateus, but that was many generations ago." Fernanda's expression shifted subtly, becoming more attentive. "Mateus is a good Portuguese name. There have been important Mateus families in Porto's history, especially connected to the wine trade and navigation." "Really? I hadn't known that." "Oh yes," Fernanda continued, studying Peter's face more carefully. "There are still buildings in the city center that belong to Mateus merchants. Perhaps during your visit, you would be interested in seeing some of these historical sites." Peter spent his first evening in Porto walking through the Ribera district, letting the city's rhythm wash over him. The rain had stopped, but the cobblestones remained wet and reflective, creating a magical atmosphere as the early evening lights began to illuminate the narrow streets and centuries-old buildings. Unlike the Spanish cities he had visited, Porto felt lived in rather than preserved. Children played in small squares while their grandparents watched from doorways. Restaurants spilled out onto sidewalks with the casual confidence of establishments that had been serving the same families for decades, and the sound of Portuguese conversation created a musical backdrop that was both foreign and oddly comforting. Peter found himself drawn to the river, where traditional Rebelo boats, the flat-bottomed vessels once used to transport port wine barrels down the Douro from the vineyard regions, bobbed gently at their moorings. Across the water, the famous port wine lodges of Vila Nova de Gaia displayed their signs in elegant script. Taylor's, Sandman, Graham's, and dozens of others that had been aging fortified wine in oak barrels for centuries. At a small restaurant overlooking the river, Peter ordered bacalhau à brás and a glass of vintage port, determined to experience the culinary traditions that had shaped his ancestors' world. The elderly waiter, noticing Peter's careful pronunciation of Portuguese words, struck up a conversation about the city's history and its connections to the broader world. "Porto has always been a city of navigators and merchants," the waiter explained in accented English. "We look outward to the ocean, not inward to the land. That is why so many Porto families spread across the world, but they always maintain connections to home." "Do you know anything about families named Mateus who were involved in navigation or trade?" The waiter's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, you are perhaps related to the Mateus navigators? There is much history there, much pride. They were among the families who helped establish Portugal's connections to the New World." Peter felt his pulse quicken. "Are there still records of these families? Places where their history is preserved?" "Of course," the waiter replied. "Portuguese families take great care to preserve their histories. You should visit the Casa de Guitarra tomorrow. It is not far from here, and the proprietor knows much about the old merchant families. Tell him that Manuel from the Taberna do Real sent you." As Peter walked back to his hotel through streets that grew quieter as the evening progressed, he found himself feeling more relaxed than he had since leaving Chicago. Porto's combination of historical weight and contemporary vitality created an atmosphere where past and present seemed to coexist comfortably, without the tension he had experienced in Spanish cities, where his family's secrets felt dangerous rather than simply interesting. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Atlantic air washed clean by the previous evening's rain. Peter began his exploration of Porto with a systematic walk through the city center, looking for the historical sites that Fernanda had mentioned and following up on Manuel's suggestion to visit the Casa de Guitarra. The Casa de Guitarra turned out to be a small museum and cultural center dedicated to Portuguese fado music, housed in a beautiful 17th century building that had been carefully restored to showcase traditional Portuguese craftsmanship. The proprietor, a scholarly man named Dr. Antonio Silva, welcomed Peter with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved sharing Portuguese cultural history with visitors. "Manuel told me you might visit," Dr. Silva said after Peter introduced himself. "He mentioned that you are researching the Mateus family history?" "Yes, though I'm not sure how much information has survived from the early periods." Dr. Silva smiled mysteriously. "Portuguese families are very good at preserving their histories, even when those histories become complicated. Come, let me show you something that might interest you." He led Peter to a small archive room behind the main museum space, where carefully preserved documents and artifacts told the stories of Porto families who had been involved in Portuguese maritime exploration. In one display case, Peter saw navigational instruments that looked identical to those he had found in the hidden chambers beneath the Alhambra. The Mateus family, Dr. Silva explained, were particularly notable for their role in establishing trade networks that connected Portugal not just to the New World, but also to other European cities. They were, you might say, early pioneers of international commerce. Dr. Silva showed Peter several documents that referenced Mateus family activities in the 16th and 17th centuries. The records were fragmentary, but they painted a picture of a family that had been deeply involved in Portuguese expansion while also maintaining extensive business relationships with Spanish, French, and German merchants. "What's interesting about the Mateus family," Dr. Silva continued, "is that they seem to have developed expertise in what we might now call cultural preservation. They helped establish libraries and archives in several Portuguese colonies, and they were known for their ability to move valuable manuscripts and artifacts safely across long distances." Peter felt the familiar excitement of discovery. Are there still members of the Mateus family in Porto? Or records of what happened to their business operations? "That is a more complicated question," Dr. Silva replied carefully. "The family maintained offices in Porto until quite recently, but they became increasingly private about their activities. However, if you are genuinely interested in your family's history, there are people in the city who could help you learn more." Dr. Silva wrote down an address on a piece of paper. "This is the location of what was once the main Mateus family office. The building is still there, though I'm not certain what it's used for now. But if you're serious about understanding your heritage, it would be a logical place to begin." What do you think Peter will find at the original Mateus family office? Could his ancestors' Portuguese operations still be active after all these centuries? Share your predictions in the comments. The address Dr. Silva had given Peter led to a narrow street near the São Bento train station, in a district that blended commercial activity with residential neighborhoods. The building itself was elegant but understated, a four-story structure with traditional Portuguese architecture that could easily house offices, apartments, or both. A brass nameplate by the entrance read, "Escritorios Mateus and Associados," established 1487, confirming that Peter had found the right location. But the building appeared to be closed, with shuttered windows and no signs of current activity. Peter walked around the building, looking for alternative entrances or signs of occupation. In an alley behind the main structure, he noticed that one of the upper floor windows had been left slightly open, and there were what appeared to be modern security cameras discreetly positioned to monitor the rear entrance. His Chicago experience had taught him to read the signs of surveillance and security, and everything about this building suggested that it was much more active than its abandoned appearance implied. The question was whether he should try to gain access, or whether doing so would trigger exactly the kind of attention he had been trying to avoid. As Peter stood in the alley considering his options, an elderly Portuguese man approached him from the street. "Excuse me," the man said in accented English. "Are you perhaps looking for the Mateus offices?" Peter's pulse quickened. "I might be. Are you familiar with the building?" The man smiled knowingly. "I am João Tavares. I have been, shall we say, maintaining certain responsibilities related to the Mateus family properties for many years. And you, I believe, are Peter Matthews from Chicago." The fact that this stranger knew his name and origin made Peter instinctively cautious. "How did you know that?" Word travels quickly in Porto, especially regarding members of families that have historical significance to the city. "Mr. Matthews, I have been expecting someone from your branch of the family to visit for quite some time." João Tavares had the manner of someone who was accustomed to dealing with sensitive matters discreetly. "If you are interested in learning about your family's Portuguese heritage, I would be happy to arrange a proper introduction. But perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." João Tavares led Peter to a traditional Portuguese restaurant called O Fado Nosso, located in a converted 16th century house that specialized in providing intimate settings for fado performances. The restaurant's walls were covered with photographs of famous fado singers, and the atmosphere was designed to celebrate Portugal's most distinctive musical tradition. Fado and Portuguese maritime history are more connected than most people realize, João explained as they settled into a quiet corner table. Both traditions deal with themes of longing, separation, and the connections that bind people across great distances. As they shared a lunch of grilled sardines and vinho verde, João began to reveal his knowledge of Peter's family history. His information was far more detailed and recent than what Peter had learned from Dr. Silva or the documents he had found throughout Spain. "Your grandfather," João said, maintained regular communication with the Portuguese operations until his death. He was, you might say, the American coordinator for activities that required coordination between the Old World and the New World. Peter nearly choked on his wine. "My grandfather? The quiet bookkeeper from Chicago. Quiet, perhaps, but hardly inactive," João replied with a gentle smile. "The preservation network that your family helped establish has always required coordinators in multiple countries. Your grandfather's role was to manage North American operations and to ensure that resources could flow between the Americas and Europe when necessary." João showed Peter several photographs on his phone, images of his grandfather as a much younger man, standing with other people in front of buildings Peter recognized from his Spanish journey. One photo showed his grandfather with Klaus's grandfather in front of the Alhambra. Another showed him with several people in front of what appeared to be the Bodega de los Secretos in La Rioja. "The network has always been a family affair," João continued. "Not just your family, but multiple families who have maintained these connections for centuries. Your grandfather understood that his role was to prepare the next generation, you to eventually take on greater responsibilities." "But he never told me any of this," Peter protested. "I grew up thinking he was just a simple bookkeeper." "He was protecting you," João replied. "The network has always believed that its inheritors should discover their heritage gradually, when they are ready to understand both its opportunities and its responsibilities. Your journey through Spain was designed to provide that gradual education." As if summoned by their conversation, João's phone buzzed with a text message. After reading it, his expression became more serious. "Mr. Matthews, it appears that your Spanish associates have been asking questions about your whereabouts. They seem quite anxious to continue their conversations with you." Peter felt his brief sense of safety beginning to evaporate. "Klaus and his people have tracked me to Porto?" "Not yet, but they are making inquiries, which means we need to decide quickly whether you are ready to accept the protection and responsibilities that come with your Portuguese heritage, or whether you prefer to continue avoiding the inevitable conversation about your future." That afternoon, João escorted Peter to the Mateus family office building, using a key that suggested he had legitimate access to the property. Inside, Peter discovered that the building was far from abandoned. It housed a sophisticated operation that looked like a combination of law firm, financial services company, and cultural research institute. The ground floor contained a reception area and meeting rooms decorated with historical maritime artifacts and portraits of Portuguese navigators. The upper floors housed offices where several people worked quietly at computers and with documents, conducting business that appeared to involve international communications and financial transactions. This is the current headquarters of the Portuguese branch of your family's network, João explained as he showed Peter through the facilities. We coordinate with similar offices in Madrid, Barcelona, Frankfurt, and several other European cities. Peter examined the documents and computer screens he could see, recognizing the same kinds of financial records and coded communications he had found in the hidden chambers throughout Spain. But the Portuguese operation appeared to be much larger and more sophisticated than what he had discovered elsewhere. How many people work for the network? Peter asked. Directly employed, perhaps 50 people across all locations, João replied. But our activities involve hundreds of affiliated individuals and organizations. We are, you might say, a coordinating hub for activities that require international cooperation. In a conference room on the third floor, João showed Peter a detailed presentation about the network's current operations. The scope was breathtaking: humanitarian assistance programs in 12 countries, cultural preservation projects in dozens of locations, and financial services that helped people and organizations move resources across international boundaries quickly and discreetly. Your inheritance, João explained, includes not just access to accounts and properties that have been accumulating value for centuries. It includes responsibility for coordinating activities that affect thousands of people who depend on the network for their safety and security. Peter studied the financial statements that João showed him. The numbers were staggering: assets worth over €1 billion, distributed across investments, real estate, and liquid accounts in dozens of countries. But more importantly, the operational reports showed that the network was actively helping an average of 300 people per month relocate, protect assets, or access resources they couldn't obtain through normal channels. This is overwhelming, Peter admitted. I came to Spain looking for simple answers about my family history. I never expected to discover that I was inheriting responsibility for an international organization. João nodded, understanding. That is why the network has always introduced its inheritors gradually. But Mr. Matthews, circumstances have accelerated your education. Your Spanish associates are becoming impatient, and there are other parties who have become aware of your activities. We cannot continue protecting you indefinitely without your active cooperation. As if summoned by João's warning, Peter's phone rang. The caller ID showed Klaus's number, which he hadn't seen since escaping from the vineyard in La Rioja. Answer it, João advised. But remember that you now have options you didn't have before. Hello, Klaus, Peter said, accepting the call. Peter, thank God. We've been worried about you since La Rioja. Are you safe? I'm safe. And I'm learning things that you should have told me weeks ago. Where are you? Klaus pressed. We need to continue our conversation about your family's network and your role in its future. Peter looked at João, who nodded encouragingly. I'm in Porto, Klaus, learning about the Portuguese side of my inheritance. There was a pause on the line before Klaus responded. Peter, that's potentially problematic. The Portuguese operations have been autonomous for decades. We're not certain their priorities align with the broader network's humanitarian goals. What do you mean by that? I mean that different branches of your family's network have developed different approaches to their responsibilities over the centuries. Some focus more on humanitarian assistance, others on cultural preservation, and some on financial activities that serve their own interests rather than the network's original mission. João was listening to the conversation and shaking his head in apparent disagreement with Klaus's characterization. Klaus, I think you and I have different understandings of what the network's original mission actually was. Peter, please be careful about who you trust. The Portuguese operations have access to resources and information that could be very dangerous if they're not managed properly. We need to meet in person to discuss how to proceed safely. And if I refuse to meet with you, then you're making a choice to trust people you've known for less than a week over people who have been protecting your interests for months. Peter looked around the conference room where he sat, surrounded by evidence of an organization that appeared to be both sophisticated and genuinely committed to helping people in need. Then he thought about his experiences with Klaus, which had involved manipulation, deception, and ultimately threats when cooperation wasn't freely given. "Klaus, I'll call you back when I've decided what I want to do. Peter, don't make any irreversible commitments until we've had a chance to discuss all your options." "I'll keep that in mind." After ending the call, Peter sat in silence for several minutes, processing the choice he knew he could no longer avoid. The rain had returned to Porto, pattering against the conference room windows and creating a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the momentous decision he needed to make. "Mr. Matthews," João said quietly, "your family's network has survived for over 500 years because it has always attracted people who understand the difference between power that serves itself and power that serves others. The choice you make now will determine not just your own future, but the future of an organization that has helped preserve knowledge and protect people through centuries of upheaval." Peter watched the rain falling on the narrow streets of Porto, where his ancestors had begun the journey that had led to this moment. The city felt like home in a way that Chicago never had, and the people he had met here seemed to understand both the opportunities and the responsibilities of his inheritance better than those who had been pressuring him in Spain. "João," Peter said finally, "I think it's time I learned what accepting my Portuguese heritage really means. Thank you for staying with us through Peter's arrival in Portugal." The rain-soaked streets of Porto welcomed him home to a family legacy that's both more complex and more inspiring than he ever imagined. The original Mateus family office is still operating after 5 centuries, coordinating humanitarian work across 12 countries and managing over €1 billion in assets dedicated to helping people in need. But Klaus's warnings about the Portuguese operations suggest that not everyone in the network shares the same vision for its future. Peter now faces the choice he's been avoiding since Madrid: accept responsibility for leading a network that has been saving lives and preserving culture for centuries, or continue trying to escape from a legacy that seems determined to claim him. Porto's welcoming atmosphere and the genuine care shown by João and the Portuguese operations have given Peter his first real sense of belonging since leaving Chicago. But Klaus's warnings remind him that accepting this inheritance means choosing sides in conflicts he doesn't fully understand. What do you think Peter should do? Trust the Portuguese branch that feels like home, or believe Klaus's warnings about their true motivations? And what secrets might the full network be hiding that even Peter hasn't discovered yet? Don't miss the next episode, The Cafe of Forgotten Dreams in Coimbra, where Peter will discover that some family secrets are preserved not in hidden chambers or ancient documents, but in the dreams and memories of people who have been waiting decades for his arrival. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible journey. Peter's most important decision is just ahead, and it will change everything. The morning train from Porto to Coimbra carried Peter and João through the Portuguese countryside, following the path of the Douro River before turning inland toward the ancient university city. Peter had spent the previous evening in deep conversation with João about the network's Portuguese operations, and he had agreed to visit Coimbra before making his final decision about accepting his inheritance. "Coimbra is special to Portuguese hearts," João explained as the train approached the city. "It was our capital before Lisbon, and its university has educated Portuguese leaders for over 700 years. But more importantly for your family's story, Coimbra has always been a place where knowledge is preserved and secrets are kept safe." As they emerged from the train station, Peter was immediately struck by how different Coimbra felt from Porto. Where Porto had been commercial and maritime, oriented toward the ocean and international trade, Coimbra was academic and contemplative, built around the hilltop university that dominated the city's skyline like a fortress of learning. The streets leading up toward the university were filled with students wearing traditional black capes, a custom that dated back centuries and gave the city an almost medieval atmosphere. Bookstores, cafes, and small restaurants catered to generations of scholars who had made Coimbra their intellectual home. "Your grandfather loved this city," João said as they climbed the steep streets toward the historic center. "He visited at least once a year, sometimes more often. He said that Coimbra reminded him that knowledge and tradition could coexist with progress and change. Peter felt a pang of emotion at the mention of his grandfather. The quiet man he had known in Chicago seemed to have lived an entirely different life that his family had never suspected. "Did he ever mention me during these visits?" "Often," João replied with a gentle smile. He talked about his grandson who asked too many questions, who noticed details that other people missed, who seemed restless with ordinary life. He said you reminded him of himself at your age. They checked into a small hotel near the Praça da República, in the heart of the student district. From their rooms, Peter could hear the sounds of young people going about their daily routines, heading to classes, meeting friends at cafes, discussing ideas and dreams with the passionate intensity that universities around the world inspired. After settling in, João led Peter on a walking tour of the city, explaining how Coimbra's layout reflected centuries of Portuguese history. The lower town, along the Mondego River, was where the common people had always lived and worked. The upper town, dominated by the university, represented the intellectual and spiritual aspirations that had driven Portugal's age of exploration and discovery. The University of Coimbra was founded in 1290, João explained as they approached the main gates. It's one of the oldest universities in continuous operation in the world. Many of Portugal's greatest navigators, scientists, and leaders studied here. The university complex was breathtaking, a collection of buildings that spanned centuries of architectural styles, from medieval stone structures to Baroque churches to neoclassical academic halls. But the crown jewel was clearly the Biblioteca Joanina, the magnificent Baroque library that João said they would visit the next day. Your grandfather had special access to the library's restricted collections, João explained. The Mateus family has been benefactors of the university for centuries, and that relationship has given your family access to resources that aren't available to ordinary researchers. That evening, they had dinner at a traditional restaurant called Zé Manuel dos Ossos, a tiny establishment so authentic that there was no written menu. The waiter simply recited what had been cooked that day, over plates of chanfana and glasses of Dao wine. João began to prepare Peter for what he would discover the next day. Your grandfather left something for you in Coimbra, João said carefully. Something personal, meant only for you to find when you were ready to understand your family's legacy. What kind of something? A message, an explanation, perhaps even a justification for choices he made that affected your life without your knowledge. Peter felt his appetite diminish as the significance of João's words sank in. When did he leave this message? About 5 years before his death. He was already ill, but his mind was still sharp. He knew that you would eventually come to Portugal seeking answers, and he wanted to ensure that you heard certain truths from him directly rather than from others who might have different agendas. The next morning, João arranged for a private tour of the Biblioteca Joanina before the library opened to regular tourists. The head librarian, a distinguished woman named Dr. Helena Rodrigues, greeted them personally and seemed to have been expecting their visit. "Mr. Matthews," she said in excellent English, "your grandfather was a dear friend to this library for many decades. We were very sad to learn of his passing, and we have been waiting for you to come claim what he left in our care." The library itself was one of the most beautiful spaces Peter had ever seen. 3 magnificent halls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, their gilded spines creating a tapestry of knowledge that stretched back centuries. Baroque decorations covered every surface, painted ceilings depicting allegories of learning and wisdom, intricate woodwork that spoke of master craftsmen, and reading tables made from exotic woods brought from Portuguese colonies. The library contains over 60,000 volumes, Dr. Rodrigues explained as she led them through the main halls. Many are extremely rare, and some are the only surviving copies of important historical works. But we also maintain a special collection of materials that have been placed in our care by Portuguese families for safekeeping. She led them to a private study room off the main library halls, a small chamber that was clearly used for examining rare materials and conducting sensitive research. On the study table sat a single book, a beautiful 18th century edition of Os Lusíadas, Portugal's national epic poem written by Luís de Camões. Your grandfather placed this volume in our care 15 years ago, Dr. Rodriguez explained. He gave very specific instructions that it should only be released to Peter Matthews, grandson of Thomas Matthews, when that person came to Coimbra seeking information about the Mateus family. Peter approached the book with trembling hands. He knew I would come here? He was quite certain of it. He said that you were too curious and too intelligent to simply accept the inheritance without seeking to understand its origins and meaning. Dr. Rodriguez excused herself to give Peter privacy, explaining that she would be available if he needed anything. João moved to leave as well, but Peter asked him to stay. What do you think Peter's grandfather wrote in this message he left 15 years ago? Could he have predicted everything that's happened to Peter on this journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. Peter opened Os Lusíadas carefully, aware that he was handling a valuable historical artifact. The book fell open naturally to Canto 3, where a folded letter had been inserted between the pages. The envelope was addressed in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, "For Peter Matthews, when the time comes." With hands that shook slightly, Peter opened the envelope and began to read. "My dear Peter, if you are reading this letter, then you have traveled much further than the distance from Chicago to Portugal. You have journeyed through our family's history, discovered secrets that we kept hidden to protect you, and arrived at the moment where you must decide whether to accept a legacy that stretches back over 500 years. I want you to know that everything your grandmother and I told you about our simple life in Chicago was true. We were just ordinary people trying to live quietly and raise our family in peace. But we were also the American coordinators of a network that has been protecting people and preserving knowledge since 1487, and that dual existence required constant vigilance and many difficult choices. I didn't tell you about your inheritance when you were young because I wanted you to develop your own identity, your own values, your own sense of who you wanted to be. Too many children born into families like ours become trapped by expectations and responsibilities before they have a chance to discover themselves. But I watched you carefully as you grew, Peter. I saw your curiosity about how things worked, your ability to notice patterns that others missed, your natural skill at understanding what people really wanted beneath what they said they wanted. These are the qualities that have made Mateus family members effective guardians of the network for generations. I also saw your strong sense of justice, your discomfort with dishonesty, and your desire to make your own way in the world rather than accepting inherited privilege. These qualities worried me, because they suggested you might reject the inheritance entirely once you learned about its moral complexities. The network your ancestors created is not simple or pure. It has saved thousands of lives over the centuries, but it has also operated outside legal frameworks and sometimes cooperated with morally questionable partners in order to protect its humanitarian mission. You will have to make peace with this complexity if you choose to accept leadership of the Portuguese branch. I am writing this letter 5 years before I expect to die, which means I still have time to change course if circumstances warrant. But I believe with all my heart that you are the right person to inherit this responsibility. You have the intelligence to understand the network's operations, the compassion to maintain its humanitarian focus, and the independence to resist pressures from those who would use the network for purely selfish purposes. There are people who will try to manipulate you, Peter. Some will emphasize the humanitarian achievements to make the inheritance seem noble and necessary. Others will emphasize the moral compromises to make you feel guilty about accepting it. Both perspectives are true, but neither tells the complete story. The truth is this: the network exists because the official institutions of governments and organizations often fail to protect the people who most need protection. We operate in the spaces that laws and regulations cannot reach, helping people who fall through the cracks of official systems. This work is important, but it comes with risks and responsibilities that not everyone can handle. If you are reading this in Coimbra, then João Tavares has brought you here as I instructed. You can trust João completely. He has been my partner in the Portuguese operations for over 30 years, and he understands both the opportunities and the dangers of the network better than anyone else I know. I want you to also know about Klaus Weber. His family has worked with ours for generations, and Klaus himself is brilliant and dedicated to the network's mission. But Klaus's branch of the operation has developed different priorities over the years, focusing more on financial preservation than humanitarian assistance. This doesn't make him your enemy. but it does mean you should be careful about whose vision for the network's future you choose to support. My advice to you, Peter, is this: accept the inheritance, but accept it on your own terms. The network needs leadership that can balance humanitarian goals with practical survival, that can preserve the past while adapting to the future, and that can resist the temptation to use accumulated power for personal gain. Your grandmother and I loved you very much, and we were very proud of the man you became even without knowing about your heritage. Whatever you decide about the inheritance, know that you have already exceeded our hopes for you. Be brave, be honest, and trust your instincts. With all my love, your grandfather Thomas Matthews, Tomas Mateus. Peter read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and emotion. His grandfather's voice came through so clearly in the words that he could almost hear the old man speaking them, with the same gentle wisdom that had characterized their conversations during Peter's childhood. He knew, Peter said finally, looking up at João with tears in his eyes. He knew exactly what I would go through, what questions I would have, what doubts I would face. João nodded with visible emotion. Your grandfather understood you better than you realized. He spent years planning how to guide you toward this moment without forcing you into choices you weren't ready to make. The letter mentions you specifically. He said, I can trust you completely. As you can, João replied. Thomas and I worked together for over 3 decades. He taught me that the network's greatest asset isn't its accumulated wealth or its historical connections. It's the trust between people who share a commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Peter carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it in his jacket pocket. I need to think about all this. Is there somewhere we can go that's less formal than a library? João smiled. I know exactly the place. Your grandfather's favorite cafe in Coimbra. They left the university and walked down into the lower town, eventually arriving at a magnificent old cafe housed in the former refectory of a medieval monastery. The Café Santa Cruz was a grand space with high vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows, and marble tables where students and locals had gathered for over a century. Your grandfather sat at that table every time he visited Coimbra, João said, pointing to a corner spot near one of the large windows. He said the light was perfect for reading, and the coffee was strong enough to keep an old man alert. They ordered bica and pastéis de nata, and Peter found himself looking around the cafe with new understanding. This had been part of his grandfather's life, part of the world he inhabited when he wasn't being a quiet bookkeeper in Chicago. How many other sacred spaces had the old man visited? How many other lives had he touched while maintaining the fiction of an ordinary existence? Thank you for staying with us through this emotional revelation. Peter's grandfather's letter explained so much about the journey and the choices ahead. The wisdom and love in those words are incredibly moving. What do you think Peter will decide now that he's heard directly from his grandfather? As they sat in the cafe, João began to share more stories about Thomas Matthews, stories about his wit, his kindness, his occasional stubbornness, and his deep commitment to the network's humanitarian mission. Peter listened hungrily, discovering dimensions of his grandfather that had been hidden behind the modest persona he had shown his American family. He talked often about the guilt he felt for keeping secrets from your grandmother and your mother, João said. But he believed it was necessary to protect them. The network has enemies, Peter. People who would have used his family as leverage if they had known about his activities. What kind of enemies? Governments that don't like unregulated international financial networks. Criminal organizations that want access to the network's smuggling routes for their own purposes. Collectors who believe that historical artifacts belong to whoever can take them, not to the cultures that created them. Peter thought about the threatening messages he had received, the mysterious figures who had followed him from city to city, and the pressure that Klaus had applied in La Rioja. Am I in danger by accepting this inheritance? You're in danger either way, João replied honestly. You know too much to simply walk away now. The only question is whether you accept the inheritance and gain access to the network's protection and resources, or whether you try to live with the knowledge you've acquired while having no support from the people who could help keep you safe. The pragmatic assessment helped Peter think more clearly about his situation. His grandfather's letter had provided emotional context, but João was offering practical analysis. Together, they painted a picture of an inheritance that was neither purely noble nor completely compromising, but rather a complex responsibility that required constant moral navigation. João, my grandfather's letter suggested that I should accept the inheritance on my own terms. What does that mean in practice? It means you can choose which aspects of the network's operations you want to emphasize and which you want to reform or eliminate. As the Mateus family inheritor, you would have significant influence over how the Portuguese operations are conducted. You wouldn't be obligated to simply continue everything exactly as it has been done for centuries. And Klaus's branch? How would they respond to changes I might want to make? João's expression became more guarded. That would depend on what changes you propose. The different branches of the network cooperate because it's in everyone's interest, but there are also tensions between those who prioritize humanitarian assistance and those who focus on financial preservation. Your choices could tip the balance one way or another. Peter spent the rest of the day walking through Coimbra, thinking about everything he had learned and everything he still didn't understand. He visited the botanical garden, where university students studied amid exotic plants brought from former Portuguese colonies. He sat in the cathedral where generations of Portuguese monarchs had been crowned. He watched the sunset from the university's tower, looking out over a city that had educated explorers who literally changed the world's map. Everywhere he went, Peter thought about his grandfather's letter and the choice it presented. He could accept the inheritance and become the leader of an international network that had been operating for over 500 years. Or he could try to walk away from a legacy that was already shaping his life, whether he accepted it or not. By evening, Peter knew what his decision would be. He called João and asked to meet again at Café Santa Cruz, at his grandfather's favorite table. "I've made my decision," Peter said once they were settled with their coffee. "I'm going to accept the inheritance, but with conditions." João leaned forward attentively. "What conditions?" "First, I want complete transparency about all of the network's current operations. No more surprises, no more convenient omissions, no more discoveries of activities that I should have known about from the beginning. That can be arranged. Second, I want a full review of the network's financial activities to ensure that we're actually using our resources for humanitarian purposes rather than just accumulating wealth for its own sake." João nodded approval. "Your grandfather would have supported that condition completely. Third, I want the Portuguese operations to have more autonomy from Klaus's branch. I don't trust his motivations, and I don't want the humanitarian mission to be compromised by purely financial interests. That will cause tension," João warned, "but it's a reasonable position, and one that the Portuguese Council will likely support. And finally," Peter continued, "I want to modernize how the network operates. The world has changed since 1487. We should be using contemporary methods and technologies to achieve our goals, not just relying on traditions because that's how things have always been done." João smiled broadly. "Peter, you sound exactly like your grandfather when he first took on leadership responsibilities. He also wanted to reform and modernize, and he succeeded in making significant changes while preserving the network's core mission. So you'll support my conditions?" "I'll support them enthusiastically, and I believe most of the Portuguese Council will as well." Peter felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Then I guess I should make some phone calls, starting with Klaus." Peter stepped outside the cafe to make the call, wanting privacy for what would likely be a difficult conversation. Klaus answered on the second ring, his voice tense with anticipation. "Peter, where are you? We've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm in Coimbra, Klaus, and I've made my decision about the inheritance. And I'm accepting it. I'll take leadership of the Portuguese operations and my position in the broader network." There was a long pause before Klaus responded. "That's excellent news, Peter. We're very pleased that you've decided to embrace your family's legacy. But there are conditions," Peter continued. "The Portuguese operations will maintain significant autonomy. I'll be implementing reforms to ensure that humanitarian goals take priority over financial accumulation. And I expect complete transparency about all network activities going forward." Another pause, this one more tense. Those are significant changes to propose before you've even formally accepted your inheritance. They're not proposals, Klaus. They're requirements. My grandfather's letter made it clear that I should accept the inheritance on my own terms, and these are my terms. Your grandfather's letter? Klaus's voice sharpened with interest. What letter? One he left for me 15 years ago in Coimbra. He had quite a bit to say about the different branches of the network and their competing priorities. Klaus was silent for several moments. I see. Well, Peter, I look forward to discussing these requirements with you in person. Perhaps we should arrange a meeting of all the network's branch leaders to discuss how to integrate you into the existing structure. That sounds like a good idea, but Klaus, I want you to understand that I'm not interested in being integrated into the existing structure. I'm interested in reforming that structure to better serve the network's humanitarian mission. We'll see, Klaus replied, his tone revealing both respect and concern. Congratulations on your decision, Peter. You're now part of something much larger than yourself. After ending the call with Klaus, Peter made another call, this one to the main Portuguese council office that João had told him about. He introduced himself formally, confirmed his decision to accept the inheritance, and requested a meeting with the full council to discuss his vision for the network's future. The council secretary, clearly prepared for his call, scheduled a meeting for the following week in Porto and expressed the council's enthusiasm about welcoming a Mateus family member back into active leadership after several years of interim management. When Peter returned to Café Santa Cruz, João was waiting with 2 glasses of port wine. A proper Portuguese toast, he explained, for celebrating important decisions. To your grandfather, João said, raising his glass, who planned this moment carefully enough that you could make a truly informed choice. To my grandfather, Peter agreed, and to the network's future, whatever that might look like. As they sipped their wine in the grand old cafe where his grandfather had once sat contemplating his own responsibilities, Peter felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since leaving Chicago. He had made his choice not out of pressure or manipulation, but out of genuine understanding of what his inheritance meant and what he wanted it to become. The journey that had started with a mysterious woman in a Madrid airport had led him through Spanish cities full of secrets, across the border into his ancestral homeland, and finally to this quiet moment in a Coimbra cafe where past and future converged. Peter Matthews had become Peter Mateus, accepting a legacy that stretched back 500 years, while preparing to transform it for the centuries ahead. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible emotional journey in Coimbra. Peter's grandfather's letter provided the clarity and confidence he needed to make his decision. The wisdom of a man who understood both the burden and the blessing of their family legacy helped Peter see that accepting the inheritance doesn't mean accepting everything exactly as it was. Peter has made his choice. He will lead the Portuguese operations, but on his own terms. Humanitarian goals will take priority over financial accumulation. Transparency will replace secrets, and modern methods will update ancient traditions. But Klaus's response suggests that not everyone in the network will be happy with Peter's reformist vision. The tension between different branches of the operation is about to become much more explicit, and Peter will need to prove that his youth and inexperience don't disqualify him from the leadership role he's claiming. What do you think will happen when Peter meets with the full council? Will they support his vision for reform, or will established interests resist his attempts to change how things have been done for centuries? And how will Klaus respond when he realizes that Peter isn't going to be the easily manipulated inheritor he might have hoped for? Don't miss the next episode where Peter's journey continues in Lisbon, and where new challenges will test his commitment to the path he's chosen. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. Peter has accepted his destiny, but the real work is only beginning.